There is a moment in the day when a human being quietly stops feeling like the center of their own life. Not because something went wrong, not because of loss, not because someone hurt them, but because, without warning, the sense of being someone becomes smaller. Not smaller in the eyes of others, smaller inside. You are still here. Your heart is still beating. Your breath still moves in and out of your body. Nothing is broken. Nothing is missing. And yet, the feeling of I matter in this space has thinned. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't collapse. It simply loses weight. Most people don't have words for this moment. They don't point to it. They don't talk about it the next day. But almost everyone touches it. If you've ever been awake in the dark, not sad, not anxious, not thinking clearly, but not asleep either. If you've ever felt that the world was still there, time was still moving, reality was still intact, but you were no longer taking up much space inside it, then you already know this moment. This is the moment when human beings feel smallest. Before we go any further, pause for a second. Like this video, share it with someone who once said that nights feel heavier for no clear reason, and subscribe to Sleepy Scientist Recordings, not to support a channel, but to keep these kinds of recordings alive in a world that constantly asks people to be louder, sharper, and larger than they really are. During the day, we are reinforced. We wake up into structure. We wake up into tasks, into names, into expectations. The daytime brain works hard to hold you together. As a central character, you are the one responding, the one deciding, the one managing time, the one carrying a narrative called my life. Even exhaustion during the day still keeps you intact, tired, but defined. But when the day ends, something begins to loosen. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It starts when there is nothing left to answer. No messages that demand urgency. No roles that need to be performed. No one actively reflecting you back to yourself. The brain notices this absence. Before you do, the systems responsible for action and control begin to quiet down. Not shut off, just step back. And when they do, the sense of being someone in charge is no longer constantly reinforced. This is not failure. This is not weakness. It is simply what happens when the mind is no longer required to hold a tight shape. As external demands fade, the brain stops spending energy maintaining the illusion of centrality. You are still real, but you are no longer framed. During the day, your thoughts move forward. They point outward. They solve. They aim. At night, thoughts lose direction. They don't build. They don't conclude. They drift. And drifting thoughts do not support a strong sense of self. Instead of, I am doing, there is only, this is happening. Instead of, I need to be, there is simply, there is. This is the first layer of smallness. Not emotional, not philosophical, cognitive. The brain, conserving energy, reduces the effort required to keep you feeling like the center of things. What remains is awareness without importance. You notice sounds, but they don't feel related to you. You notice time passing, but it doesn't feel like it belongs to you. You notice your own body, but not as a project, more like an object resting in space. Many people mislabel this moment. They call it loneliness, or emptiness, or sadness. But it is none of those, at least not at its core. Loneliness requires longing. Sadness requires loss. This moment requires neither. It is the experience of decentering. For most of the day, the human nervous system works to keep you at the center of perception. At night, that effort is reduced. And when the effort stops, the mind does not rush to replace it. It allows the center to dissolve slightly. This can feel unsettling. because we are trained to equate importance with safety. To feel small feels, at first, like something is wrong, but nothing is wrong. What you are experiencing is a state your species has known far longer than electric lights, far longer than clocks, far longer than schedules. Long before humans explained themselves with words, there were nights where the self became quiet and existence continued anyway. Your nervous system remembers this, not as memory, not as story, as sensation. That is why the feeling is vague. Why? It has no clear image. Why it resists explanation. It arrives as a shift in scale. You don't vanish. You don't expand. You simply stop being the reference point, and the body responds immediately. Breathing slows. Muscle tension softens. The urge to act fades. The system prepares for rest, not by turning you off, but by making you smaller. This is not sleep yet. This is the space before sleep, where the mind experiments with letting go of its own outline. Some people fight this moment. They reach for stimulation, noise, screens, distraction, not because they are bored, but because distraction restores scale. It gives the mind something to orbit, something to be about. But when nothing is added, when the night is allowed to remain quiet, the mind continues its gentle retreat. And in that retreat, the sensation of smallness becomes clearer, not threatening, not crushing, just unmistakable. A quiet realization that the world does not require your constant presence to keep going. And that realization, for better or worse, tends to arrive when the light fades and the day releases you from being necessary. Not every hour of the day carries the same psychological weight. Even when the body is awake for 16 hours, the mind does not experience those hours equally. There are stretches of time when the sense of self feels solid, almost reinforced by momentum. And there are other stretches when that solidity begins to soften, as if the mind itself were slowly stepping backward, creating distance between awareness and identity. If we look closely at a full day, we can feel this shift without needing to analyze it. Morning arrives with direction. The mind wakes up already leaning forward. Even before the body moves, there is a quiet anticipation of what must be done. Thoughts cluster around purpose. Time feels segmented. Minutes are units. Hours are containers. In the morning, the self feels anchored. There is a reason for being awake. There is a reason for existing now. Even fatigue in the morning does not reduce the sense of scale. It may slow you, but it does not shrink you. Midday strengthens this further. At its peak, the day presses identity outward. Tasks stack. Interactions accumulate. The nervous system stays alert, maintaining boundaries between you and everything else. During this period, it is difficult to feel small, not because life is easier, but because the mind is busy defending its central position. There is constant feedback. You act, and the world responds. You speak, and someone hears you. You move through space, and that movement has consequence. The self is reflected everywhere. Even stress reinforces identity. Even conflict does. Both say the same thing to the brain. You matter enough to react to. Afternoon begins. The slow decline, not in energy, but in coherence. Attention starts to fragment. Motivation loses its sharp edge. But the self is still intact. There are still expectations, still unfinished loops, still reasons to remain present. The feeling of being someone has not yet loosened. And then, gradually, the day ends. Not at a fixed hour, but at the moment when demand fades. For some, this happens early. For others, late. But the shift is unmistakable. Evening does something subtle. that most people never consciously notice. It removes urgency. The brain senses that fewer outcomes depend on immediate action. The future no longer feels like it is rushing toward you. Time stretches. Minutes become softer. Hours lose definition. This is the first environmental cue that the mind is allowed to let go. Still, at this stage, the self remains mostly intact. You may feel tired, but you still feel like you. You still carry your name, your concerns, your internal dialogue. You still think in full sentences, but as light continues to fade, something deeper begins to change. Night does not announce itself loudly. It does not force transformation. It invites it. The visual world simplifies. Details disappear. Edges blur. The brain, heavily reliant on vision for orientation, receives less information. And when input decreases, the mind starts to reorganize. Less stimulation means less need for constant interpretation. Less interpretation means less narrative. And without narrative, the self begins to lose density. This is why the feeling of smallness rarely arrives in the middle of the afternoon. The conditions are wrong. There is too much light, too much structure, too much reinforcement. But at night, those supports weaken. The mind is no longer surrounded by reminders of importance. No schedules blinking, no faces watching, no spaces demanding navigation. What remains is awareness without instruction, and awareness without instruction does not automatically center itself. This is the hour when many people notice something has shifted but cannot say exactly what. They may describe it as heaviness, or quiet discomfort, or an unplaceable sense of distance. But beneath all of those descriptions is the same core experience. The self is no longer being actively maintained. Cognitive science does not describe the self as a fixed object. It is a process, a continuous act of integration. Sensory input, memory, expectation, emotion, all woven together in real time to produce the feeling of being someone. This process requires energy, it requires attention, and it requires relevance. During the day, relevance is everywhere. At night, relevance thins. The brain begins to prioritize conservation, not just of physical energy, but of cognitive effort. It stops refreshing certain internal models as frequently. One of those models is the sense of personal centrality. The mind does not announce this change. It simply stops doing some of the work it was doing earlier, and the effect is immediate. Without constant reinforcement, the idea of me becomes less vivid, not absent, less vivid. This is why the feeling is so difficult to describe. You are not losing yourself. You are not disconnecting from reality. You are experiencing a reduction in self-salience. The brain is still aware, still functioning, still perceiving, but it is no longer treating the self as the primary reference point. Instead of, how does this relate to me? There is simply, this is happening. Sound exists. Darkness exists. Time moves. And you exist within it, without emphasis. This is not a pathological state. It is not dissociation. It is not numbness. It is a normal phase in the daily rhythm of consciousness. In fact, for most of human history, this phase lasted much longer than it does today. Before artificial lighting, night arrived fully. The world grew quiet. Movement slowed. Visibility dropped close to zero. Under those conditions, the mind had no reason to maintain a strong sense of individual dominance. Survival depended on stillness, on listening, on conserving energy. The nervous system adapted accordingly. Even now, with modern environments, that adaptation remains. The body recognizes night before the intellect does. Hormonal shifts begin. Neural firing patterns change. Attention turns inward, then gradually diffuses. And with that diffusion, the edges of identity soften. This is why the feeling of smallness does not strike at noon. It requires the collapse of structure. It requires quiet. It requires a moment where nothing is asking you to be anyone. When the mind senses that it is no longer being evaluated, measured, or required to perform, it begins to release its grip on importance. For some, this release feels peaceful. For others, it feels unsettling. But in both cases, the cause is the same. The day props you up. The night lets you down gently. And as the mind settles into this lowered state of demand, another shift begins to take place. Not in the external world, but in the way memory, emotion, and awareness start to rearrange themselves. In the absence of urgency, there is a narrow stretch of time that most people pass through every night without ever stopping inside it. A threshold, not fully awake, not yet asleep. A moment when the brain has already begun to release control, but consciousness has not disappeared. This is where the feeling of smallness sharpens. Earlier in the evening, the mind is still oriented outward. Thoughts may wander, but they still belong to you. They still carry your voice, your preferences, your concerns. But as the night deepens, that ownership begins to loosen. Thoughts no longer arrive on command. They drift in and out, sometimes unfinished, sometimes barely formed. The brain is no longer working for you. It is no longer optimizing, planning, or defending identity. It is transitioning. Neuroscience often describes this state as a reduction in executive control. The systems responsible for focus, decision-making, and self-monitoring gradually step back. Not abruptly, not uniformly. They fade in layers. First, the urgency dissolves. Then, intention weakens. Finally, the sense of authorship thins. You are still conscious, but you are no longer directing the flow. This is an unfamiliar experience for many people. During the day, the mind is rarely allowed to exist without a task. Even rest is structured. Even leisure is framed as something you are doing. But here, in this in-between state, there is nothing to do. And more importantly, nothing requiring you to be someone. The brain notices this absence immediately. Without goals to pursue or problems to solve, it shifts into a different mode of operation. Sensory processing becomes dominant. Instead of interpreting, the mind simply registers. A sound occurs. A shadow moves. A breath rises and falls. These events are no longer tied to meaning. They do not ask to be categorized. They do not demand response. They exist, and awareness rests lightly on them. This is why the sense of self feels smaller here. The self, as we experience it, depends on continuity, a link between past, present, and future. But in this transitional state, time begins to flatten. The past feels distant. The future loses urgency. What remains is a thin slice of now. And in a thin present, there is little room for a large identity. The brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. It is preparing for sleep by reducing complexity. Complexity is expensive. Maintaining a detailed model of who you are, what you want, and how you relate to the world require constant energy. As that energy is conserved, the model simplifies. You become less defined, not erased. Simplified. This simplification is not neutral. It carries a distinct sensation, a subtle distance between awareness and importance. You may notice that concerns, which felt heavy an hour ago, now seem strangely irrelevant, not resolved, just distant. The mind does not argue with them. It does not suppress them. It simply stops feeding them attention. This is often mistaken for avoidance, but it is not avoidance. It is disengagement driven by biology. The nervous system recognizes that sustained vigilance is no longer necessary. Muscle tone decreases. Eye movements slow. Breathing deepens almost automatically. And with these changes, the body communicates a quiet message to the mind. You are allowed to let go. This permission is unfamiliar. Most waking life is built around the opposite signal. Be alert. Be responsive. Be defined. So when the signal reverses, the mind hesitates. It does not know what to do, with awareness that has no task. And in that hesitation, the feeling of smallness intensifies. Because without tasks, without direction, the self has nothing to anchor itself to. You may still think, but the thoughts feel impersonal. They appear, but you do not feel compelled to follow them. Some dissolve before finishing. Others repeat softly, losing meaning with each cycle. This is the mind testing, how little structure it can hold, while remaining conscious. And for a brief window, consciousness exists. Without a strong sense of identity, this window is fragile. A sudden noise can close it. A bright screen can collapse it. A strong emotion can pull the self back into focus. But when undisturbed, the state deepens naturally. Awareness becomes more spacious, not expansive in a dramatic way, but less crowded. There is more room between thoughts, and in that space, you may notice something unsettling at first. Nothing is missing. The world does not collapse. When you stop actively engaging with it, time continues. The room remains. Your body breathes without instruction. Existence does not require your constant participation. This realization does not arrive as a thought. It arrives as a feeling, a quiet shrinking of importance. And this is often the moment when people first become uncomfortable, not because the experience is painful, but because it contradicts how we are trained to understand ourselves. We are taught that awareness must be purposeful, that being conscious means being active, that presence equals control. But here, presence exists without control. You are aware, but you are not steering. You are here, but you are not central. This decentering is subtle, yet profound. It does not announce itself with fear or insight. It simply feels unfamiliar. Some people describe it as fading, others as floating, others as becoming distant from their own thoughts. But all of these descriptions circle the same experience, the self loosening its grip in preparation for rest. This is not sleep yet. Sleep will come later, when consciousness itself recedes. This is something else, a moment where the mind practices existing without weight. And in this practice, the sense of being small is not an error. It is a feature. The nervous system is recalibrating scale, reminding the organism that it does not need to dominate its environment to remain safe. In this space, the boundaries between inner and outer become less rigid. Sounds feel closer, yet less personal. Thoughts feel quieter, yet less owned. You exist, but not as a project. And as this state continues, another shift quietly approaches, one that has less to do with awareness itself and more to do with what remains. When memory, intention, and narrative begin to dissolve together, the self does not disappear at night. It would be easier to understand if it did. Easier to name, easier to explain. But what happens is more subtle than disappearance. The self simply stops being reinforced. During the day, your sense of identity is actively maintained, not by willpower, but by constant input. You are reminded of who you are through action. You answer questions. You make choices. You adjust behavior based on feedback. Every interaction sharpens the outline of me. The brain is engaged in a continuous process of self-updating. This process is expensive. It requires attention, working memory, and prediction. The mind must constantly answer questions like, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? What happens next if I don't? These questions form the backbone of identity. They keep the self active. But at night, those questions lose relevance. There is no immediate outcome to manage, no future event approaching fast enough to demand preparation. And when relevance fades, the brain stops refreshing certain internal models. One of the first models to be deprioritized is the narrative self, the story you tell yourself about who you are, where you are going, and what this moment means is no longer required to be precise. So it becomes vague. Not wrong, just vague. This is why the self feels thinner, not broken. Imagine a spotlight. During the day, it is aimed directly at you, bright, focused. At night, the spotlight does not turn off. It widens, and in widening, the intensity at the center decreases. You are still illuminated, but you are no longer highlighted. Cognitive neuroscience does not treat the self as a single structure. It is an emergent phenomenon, assembled moment by moment from multiple systems working together. Attention, memory, emotion, prediction. When these systems are synchronized, the sense of self feels solid. When synchronization loosens, the self feels diffuse. At night, synchronization loosens by design. The brain begins to uncouple long-term planning from immediate awareness. Future-oriented thinking quiets. Without future pressure, the self loses its forward momentum. Identity depends on momentum more than we realize. When there is nothing to move toward, the question of who am I walks and loses urgency, and urgency is what keeps the self sharp. You might notice this. When trying to think about yourself late at night, the thoughts feel abstract. You can recall facts about your life, but they don't feel as emotionally charged. Your name feels distant. Your roles feel optional, not irrelevant. Optional. The brain is no longer insisting that these elements remain tightly bound to awareness. This is not dissociation. In dissociation, the self fragments under stress. Here, the self relaxes under safety. The nervous system detects that vigilance can be reduced. Muscles soften. Posture collapses slightly. Breathing becomes deeper, slower. These physical changes feed back into cognition. The body tells the brain, nothing needs to be held together right now. And the brain listens. It releases effort. This release is often misinterpreted as loss of control. But control was never absolute. It was a temporary coordination, maintained by demand. When demand fades, coordination relaxes. The self becomes less defined because definition requires maintenance. At night, maintenance stops. This is why the feeling of smallness is not accompanied by panic unless something interferes. If the environment is quiet, if the body feels safe, the nervous system interprets this state as appropriate. The feeling may be strange, but it is not flagged as dangerous. Instead, it is flagged as transitional, a state between effort and rest. The brain does not think in metaphors, but the experience often feels like slowly stepping backward from the center of a stage. You are still present. You can still see the scene, but you are no longer performing. This withdrawal from performance is unfamiliar in modern life. Most waking hours are built around maintaining presence, being seen, being heard, being responsive. Even when alone, many people continue to perform internally. They rehearse conversations. They replay interactions. They plan responses. All of these activities keep the self inflated. At night, when energy drops and attention diffuses, this internal performance loses momentum. The mind stops rehearsing. It does not decide to stop. It simply runs out of reason to continue. Without rehearsal, the sense of identity becomes quieter, less assertive. The self does not announce itself as loudly. This quietness can feel unsettling because we are used to identifying with constant internal narration. When narration slows, it can feel like something is missing. But what is missing is not the self itself. It is the commentary. The narrator steps aside. What remains is awareness without interpretation, perception without labeling, experience without commentary. This state is fragile. Any strong thought can reassemble the self. Any emotional spike can pull identity back into focus. But when allowed to continue, the mind naturally drifts deeper into this mode. And in this mode, the concept of importance fades. Not because nothing matters, but because nothing is being evaluated. Evaluation is the fuel of identity. When evaluation stops, the self no longer has edges. It becomes more like a presence than a person. This presence is not dramatic. It does not feel expansive or profound. It feels quiet, neutral, small. The smallness is not a judgment. It is a change in scale. During the day, you are scaled to problems. At night, you are scaled to existence. Existence does not require emphasis. It does not reward centrality. It does not ask to be interpreted. It simply continues. And as the mind adapts to this reality, another shift begins to form, one that moves even deeper than the thinning of identity toward the emotional and memory systems that quietly reshape themselves when the self is no longer holding them in place. The feeling of being small is often misunderstood, partly because language fails us here, partly because we are trained to associate certain internal sensations with danger. When something inside us fades, we assume something is wrong. But smallness is not loss. It does not arrive with grief. It does not carry fear. It does not demand relief. It simply changes scale. To understand this, it helps to notice what doesn't happen. When the feeling appears, there is no surge of anxiety, no tightening in the chest, no urgent need to escape. The body remains calm. The breath remains steady. If anything, the nervous system is quieter than usual. This immediately separates smallness from fear. Fear contracts attention. It sharpens focus. It pulls awareness tightly inward. Smallness does the opposite. Attention widens. Focus softens. The mind becomes less pointed. Fear says, "This matters right now." Smallness says nothing at all. This silence is what makes it confusing. Sadness also carries a signature. Sadness is heavy. It presses downward. It pulls memory toward loss. When sadness is present, the mind circles around what is gone. Smallness does not circle. It does not dwell. It does not revisit. Memories may appear, but they are flat. They lack emotional gravity. You can recall something painful without feeling its weight. This absence of emotional pull is not numbness. Numbness is a defense. It blocks sensation. Smallness does not block anything. It allows sensation without attaching significance to it. That distinction matters. Numbness feels hollow. Smallness feels quiet. Hollowness wants to be filled. Quiet does not. This is why many people struggle to name the experience. It does not fit into familiar categories. We are used to emotions that push or pull. Smallness does neither. It simply reduces emphasis. Existentially, this is deeply unfamiliar. Human identity is built around importance. We define ourselves by what matters to us, what depends on us, what we influence. To feel small is to feel temporarily removed from those structures, not excluded, not rejected, just unreferenced. The world does not turn away from you. It simply stops pointing at you. This can feel disorienting because attention usually flows through identity. When identity thins, attention loses its usual anchor. It floats, and floating awareness has no built-in hierarchy. Nothing stands out. Nothing demands priority. This absence of hierarchy is often mistaken for emptiness. But emptiness implies lack. Smallness implies proportion. You are still present. You are simply no longer oversized relative to your surroundings. In daylight, the self is exaggerated. It must be to function. You must believe that your actions matter, that your decisions shape outcomes, that your presence has weight. At night, those exaggerations are unnecessary. The nervous system knows this, so it recalibrates. It brings perception back into balance with the environment. This recalibration feels like shrinking, only because expansion was the norm. Imagine standing very close to a mirror. Your reflection fills the frame. Then you take a step back. Nothing disappears. Nothing breaks. The image simply returns to its natural size. That is what smallness is. A step back from the mirror of selfhood. Existential philosophy often speaks about insignificance as something overwhelming, as if realizing one's smallness should provoke dread. But lived experience tells a different story. When smallness arrives naturally, without force, without confrontation, it is rarely dramatic. It is subtle, almost gentle. The discomfort that sometimes accompanies it does not come from the feeling itself, but from resistance to it. The mind looks for something to hold, a role, a concern, a thought with weight. When none appear, the mind grows uneasy. Not because the state is harmful, but because it is unfamiliar. We are conditioned to equate identity with stability. When identity softens, we assume instability must follow. But here, the opposite is true. Physiologically, this state is associated with safety. Heart rate decreases. Cortisol levels drop. Muscle tension reduces. The body is not preparing for threat. It is preparing for rest. And rest requires a reduction in self-importance. You cannot fully rest while remaining the center of concern. The mind must be allowed to step aside. Smallness is how it does that. This is why the feeling often arrives without warning. It is not constructed. It emerges when conditions allow. Darkness, stillness, lack of demand. Together, they create a space where the self no longer needs to assert itself. In that space, existence continue effortlessly. You do not have to maintain it. You do not have to justify it. You are allowed to be peripheral to your own awareness. This is not annihilation. It is relief from authorship. You are no longer responsible for shaping the moment. The moment shapes itself. Many people avoid this state without realizing they are doing so. They fill the night with noise, with scrolling, with constant stimulation, not because they crave entertainment, but because stimulation restores hierarchy. It gives the mind something to orient around, something to be about. Being about something recreates the self. Smallness dissolves it. Neither is inherently better, but only one allows the nervous system to fully disengage. Only one prepares the mind for the depth of rest that follows. Smallness is not the end of identity. It is a pause, a nightly loosening that reminds the organism it does not need to be significant to be safe. This reminder is ancient, older than language, older than culture. It is embedded in the rhythm of waking and sleeping. And when the mind stops fighting it, the experience shifts again. Not toward meaning, not toward explanation, but toward a deeper quiet, where memory and emotion begin to reorganize themselves. In the absence of personal importance, night is not truly quiet. There are always sounds: a distant engine, the hum of electricity, the soft movement of air. And yet, night feels silent in a way the day never does. This silence does not come from the absence of noise. It comes from the absence of response. During the day, the mind lives inside a continuous loop of feedback. You act, and something changes. You think, and the world answers back. A message arrives. A face reacts. A task progresses. Every action leaves a trace. These traces are not just information. They are confirmation. They tell the brain that you are located at a meaningful point in the flow of events. This feedback loop is one of the strongest reinforcers of the sense of self. Without realizing it, you learn to measure your own size by how much the world responds to you. Daytime is rich with such responses. Even indifference is a response. Even resistance is feedback. Something pushes back. At night, this loop weakens. You may still move, but nothing reacts. You may still think, but nothing answers. The world does not reflect you. In the same way, the environment grows passive. Lights stay dim. Rooms remain unchanged. Time passes without markers. From a cognitive perspective, this is a profound shift. The brain expects feedback. It evolved in environments where action and consequence were tightly linked. When feedback disappears, the brain does not panic. Instead, it reorients. It reduces output. Why spend energy maintaining a high-resolution self when nothing is responding to it? This is the beginning of cognitive silence. Not the silence of thought, but the silence of confirmation. Thoughts may continue to arise, but they no longer feel important. They are not echoed. No external system amplifies them. No internal urgency pushes them forward. They appear, hover briefly, and fade. The mind notices this shift immediately. Without feedback, attention loosens. Attention without tension does not cling. It drifts. This drifting is not aimless. It is adaptive. The nervous system is recognizing that high-alert cognition is unnecessary. When nothing responds, nothing needs to be asserted. The self does not vanish here. It simply stops announcing itself. This is why the feeling of smallness often arrives alongside stillness. Stillness reduces feedback further. The less you move, the less the world reacts. And the less the world reacts, the less the mind insists on being central. This dynamic can be observed, even without introspection. If you have ever sat completely still at night, you may have noticed that time begins to feel strange. Minutes stretch, seconds lose definition. This is not boredom. Boredom arises when the mind expects stimulation and does not receive it. Here, the expectation itself is dissolving. Without expectation, there is no boredom, only openness. The brain is no longer projecting what should happen next. It has no model to maintain, and models are the backbone of identity. To feel like a someone, the mind must predict consequences, predict reactions, predict continuity. Night reduces predictability, not because the world is chaotic, but because it is inert. Nothing is happening that requires anticipation. The predictive machinery slows, and as prediction slows, identity loses structure. This is why the smallness feels so clean. It is not tangled with emotion. It is not colored by story. It is simply awareness, without forward pressure. In this state, the mind becomes more receptive than assertive. Instead of projecting meaning outward, It allows sensations to arrive without interpretation. A sound occurs. The mind does not ask why. A thought appears. The mind does not follow it. The absence of response creates a vacuum of significance. And in that vacuum, importance evaporates. You are still aware, still conscious, but no longer emphasized. This shift can feel uncanny because emphasis is deeply tied to our sense of being alive. We equate aliveness with engagement, with reaction, with impact. But here, aliveness exists without impact. You breathe, you feel, you notice, and nothing changes. Because of it, the mind registers this and relaxes further. There is no need to amplify signals, no need to maintain sharp edges. The self becomes diffuse because diffusion is efficient. This efficiency is what allows the brain to begin deeper restorative processes. Sleep is not a sudden shutdown. It is preceded by layers of disengagement, first from action, then from intention, then from narrative. Cognitive silence is one of these layers. It is the layer where the mind stops asking to be acknowledged. And when the mind stops asking, the feeling of smallness stabilizes, not as a problem, as a background condition. You are no longer waiting for something to happen. Waiting itself dissolves. This is why many people describe night as empty, even when it feels full of sensation, full of presence, empty of demand. Demand is what makes the self loud. Without it, the self recedes naturally. This recession is not a loss of identity. It is a temporary redistribution of attention. Attention turns outward, then inward, then everywhere at once, nowhere in particular. In this state, the mind does not ask what you are worth. It does not ask what you should be doing. It does not ask who you are becoming. Those questions require response. Night provides none. And without response, the questions lose momentum. They fall away, not because they are answered, but because they are no longer relevant. Relevance is a daytime construct. It depends on goals. At night, goals dissolve. What remains is a field of awareness with no center point. And in a field without a center, nothing is large. Nothing is small either. But from the perspective of a mind accustomed to centrality, this feels like shrinking. The silence of night does not push you into insignificance. It simply stops confirming your significance. And without confirmation, the mind stops insisting. This is the quiet that prepares the way for deeper internal rearrangement, a state where memory, emotion, and bodily rhythms begin to move independently of personal narrative, forming patterns that no longer belong to a single point of view. The brain does not seek meaning at all costs. This is a common misunderstanding. Meaning is useful only when it serves survival. When conditions change, the brain is willing to let meaning dissolve. At night, this willingness becomes visible as the environment grows quieter. The nervous system enters a mode focused not on expansion, but on preservation. Preservation does not require a large sense of self. In fact, a large sense of self is inefficient in low-demand conditions. So the brain begins to scale things down, not abruptly, not consciously, gradually, and with remarkable precision. The first thing it scales down is relevance. During the day, almost everything feels relevant. Sounds matter, thoughts matter, interruptions matter. Each carries potential consequence. At night, the probability of consequence drops. The brain calculates this automatically. When probability drops, investment drops, attention becomes cheaper, and with cheaper attention, the self becomes smaller. This is not metaphorical. Neural resources are literally reallocated. Regions involved in self-referential processing show reduced activity, not silence. Reduction. The mind is still aware, but it is no longer amplifying itself as the main object of concern. Instead, awareness spreads. It becomes less pointed, less personal. This spreading is protective. A nervous system that remains tightly focused in low-stimulation environments is vulnerable to fatigue. Hypervigilance without threat is costly, so the brain chooses a different strategy. It lowers the gain. Lower gain means signals are still detected, but they are not magnified. Thoughts pass without triggering chains of response. Sensations arise without demanding interpretation. Emotions soften without needing resolution. The world becomes quieter, not because it is empty, but because the mind has turned down its own volume. In this state, the self no longer needs to be large to feel safe. In fact, being large would be counterproductive. A large self requires maintenance. It requires constant updates. Constant comparaison, constant évaluation. At night, evaluation serves no function. There is nothing to optimize for, no immediate future to manage. So the brain withdraws from optimization entirely. It enters a state where the goal is not improvement, but stability. Stability is achieved through simplification, and simplification feels, from the inside, like shrinking. The sense of me does not collapse. It compresses, like a file being archived. Still intact, still accessible, just no longer active. This compression is often mistaken for loss, but loss implies damage. Nothing here is damaged. The brain is executing a well-rehearsed program, one that evolved long before modern life, required constant self-assertion. In ancestral environments, night was not a time for identity expression. It was a time for concealment, for stillness, for blending into the surroundings. A creature that remained prominent after dark was more visible, more vulnerable. So nervous systems learned to reduce salience at night, to become less noticeable. This instinct did not disappear. When danger receded, it became internalized. Modern humans no longer need to hide physically, but the brain still reduces psychological visibility. The self becomes quieter, less sharp, less central. This is not about fear. Fear would sharpen perception. Fear would heighten alertness. What happens here is the opposite. Alertness relaxes. The system signals safety by allowing the self to shrink. This is why the feeling can be oddly calming, even as it feels unfamiliar. The body recognizes that it can afford to become small. Smallness here is not insignificance. It is camouflage, a way of occupying space without drawing attention. But the attention being avoided is not external. It is internal. The mind stops watching itself. Self-monitoring decreases. You are no longer checking how you are doing. You are no longer assessing your state. You are simply in it. This absence of self-surveillance is deeply restful. Constant self-monitoring is one of the greatest cognitive burdens of waking life. Am I doing this right? Am I enough? Am I falling behind? These questions require a large self. They require comparison. At night, comparison fades, not because answers are found, but because the framework for asking dissolves. Without comparison, the self has no scale. Without scale, there is no reason to feel large. The brain recognizes that the simplest configuration is sufficient. A minimal self, just enough awareness to register safety, just enough perception to detect change, nothing more. This minimal configuration is what allows deeper physiological processes to begin. Memory consolidation, hormonal regulation, neural repair. All of these require reduced interference from self-focused thought. The mind must step aside for the body to work, and stepping aside feels like shrinking. This shrinking is not experienced as disappearance because consciousness remains. You are aware of being small. That awareness is the residue of identity that has not yet been fully archived. Some people find this residue unsettling. They feel as though they are fading, but fading implies an end. This is not an end. It is a handoff. The brain is transferring control from waking systems to restorative ones. This transfer cannot happen while the self insists on being the center of operations. So the self is gently reduced, not suppressed, not erased, reduced. And as reduction continues, the boundaries of the world begin to feel closer. Sounds feel nearer, but less intrusive. The room feels present, but less defined. Your body feels heavier, but also less demanding. These sensations are not random. They are signals that the nervous system is settling into a mode where survival no longer depends on dominance or distinction. You do not need to stand out to remain alive. You do not need to be important to remain safe. The brain understands this, even if the conscious mind resists it, and so it proceeds anyway. It continues scaling down, reducing contrast, reducing urgency, reducing self-focus, until what remains is a quiet form of presence that does not seek recognition. In this presence, the concept of me feels almost optional, not false, optional. You could pick it up again at any moment, but there is no reason to. This optionality is deeply unfamiliar to a mind trained to define itself continuously. Yet it is precisely this unfamiliarity that signals rest is near. The system is loosening its grip on identity to allow something else to take precedence, a reorganization that does not care who you think you are, but only about how your memories, your emotions, and your internal rhythms can settle into patterns that require no narrator at all. There is a common mistake people make when they encounter this nighttime smallness. They call it loneliness. The word appears almost automatically, as if any reduction in self must mean separation from others. But loneliness and smallness do not arise from the same place. Loneliness requires absence. It is a reaction to something missing. A person, a connection, a sense of being seen. Loneliness pulls outward. It looks for someone to close the gap. Smallness does not look outward. It does not search. It does not reach. It does not even ask to be understood. This distinction is subtle, but essential. You can be completely alone and feel no loneliness at all. And you can be surrounded by people and feel profoundly lonely. The feeling of smallness does not depend on either condition. It can appear in a crowded room or in total isolation because it is not about others. It is about position. Loneliness is the pain of feeling excluded from something larger. Smallness is the experience of no longer needing to be included at all. At night, when the self recedes, the mind no longer orients itself around social presence. Faces are gone, voices are absent, but more importantly, expectation is gone. You are not waiting to be acknowledged. You are not anticipating response. The social self, the part of you that measures itself through others, goes quiet. This quiet can feel like loneliness if you expect social feedback to always be present. But expectation is what creates the ache. Without expectation, absence does not hurt. It simply exists. Existential loneliness, the kind philosophers write about, is often misunderstood as emotional pain. In lived experience, it is usually neutral. It is the recognition that existence does not revolve around personal narrative. That awareness continues, even when no one is watching. This recognition can feel stark because it strips away the assumption of centrality, but it does not carry despair. Despair requires attachment. Smallness loosens attachment. When the mind enters this reduced state, it stops referencing itself through relationships, not because relationships are meaningless, but because they are not currently relevant. Relevance is situational. At night, there is no social problem to solve, no interaction to manage, no signal to interpret. The brain responds by releasing social vigilance. This release is deeply unfamiliar. In a culture that equates identity with constant connection, we are used to being mirrored, reflected, validated, or challenged. These reflections give the self edges. They define where you end and the world begins. When reflections disappear, edges soften. The self loses contrast. This loss of contrast is often mistaken for isolation, but isolation implies separation. Here, there is no separation. There is only a lack of differentiation. You are not cut off from the world. You are blended into it. At night, sounds do not feel directed at you. They simply occur. A distant car passes. The building settles. Air moves. These events are not messages. They do not demand response. And because they do not demand response, you do not feel summoned into existence. You are allowed to remain unaddressed. This is not rejection. It is freedom from being addressed at all. The discomfort some people feel here comes from habit, not harm. We are accustomed to being someone to someone. When that framework dissolves, the mind briefly searches for its place. But there is no place to find, not because you are lost, but because location is no longer defined. In existential loneliness, the pain comes from wanting to be anchored. In smallness, the anchor has been gently removed without resistance. The difference lies in desire. Loneliness desires connection. Smallness has no desire. Desire requires a self with direction. At night, direction fades. The mind stops pointing, and without pointing, there is nothing to miss. This is why the feeling often passes unnoticed. If not resisted, it becomes uncomfortable. Only when the mind insists on reasserting meaning. When it asks, where do I belong right now? Who am I in this moment? These questions cannot be answered because the system that generates answers is offline. Trying to force an answer creates tension. That tension is often mislabeled as loneliness, but it is not the night that creates discomfort. It is the attempt to remain defined when definition is unnecessary. In this reduced state, the mind does not need to locate itself socially. It is not a node in a network. It is simply awareness, occupying space. This is closer to how consciousness functioned for most of human history. Long stretches of time were spent without interaction, not because humans were isolated, but because social engagement was intermittent. The nervous system learned to tolerate non-engagement without distress. Modern life has weakened this tolerance. We are constantly stimulated by presence, even when alone. Screens, messages, voices, these keep the social self active, far beyond its natural window. At night, when stimulation drops, the social self finally rests. Resting can feel like disappearance if you are unused to it, but nothing essential is lost. You are not less real when you are not reflected. Reality does not require witnesses. To continue, this realization does not arrive as a thought. It arrives as a soft collapse of urgency. You are no longer waiting to be included. You are no longer excluded either. Inclusion and exclusion require boundaries. Smallness dissolves boundaries. You are not inside or outside. You simply are. This state is quiet enough that it often escapes notice, but it is one of the most honest experiences of existence. No role, no audience, no performance, just presence without reference. And as this presence stabilizes, another shift quietly unfolds. One where memory, unburdened by narrative and social identity, begins to surface in unexpected ways, no longer arranged around who you are, but around how the mind itself remembers when no one is watching. Long before the mind learned to explain itself, night already existed. There were no rooms then, no walls to contain sound, no clocks to divide time into meaning. When darkness arrived, it arrived completely. The world did not dim, it vanished. For early humans, night was not an extension of the day. It was a different reality. Vision collapsed first. Shapes dissolved. Distance disappeared. The world became something you could not dominate with your eyes. And when vision weakens, the brain shifts its strategy. It stops trying to control space. Instead, it listens. Stillness becomes intelligence. Movement becomes risk. In those conditions, being large was dangerous. Standing out meant being seen. Being seen meant vulnerability. So nervous systems adapted, not by shutting down awareness, but by reducing salience. The organism learned to exist without emphasis, to occupy space quietly, to feel present without feeling important. This is where the modern sensation of smallness finds its oldest roots. It is not a cultural invention. It is not a philosophical conclusion. It is a bodily memory passed down through generations of nervous systems that learned how to survive the dark. At night, the brain did not need a strong narrative self. There was no story to perform. There was only environment and the need to remain unnoticed. Self-awareness was useful only insofar as it maintained safety. Too much self-focus was a liability. Attention had to be spread thin, listening for danger, feeling temperature shifts, sensing movement in the ground. A narrow, centralized self would have missed these signals. So the mind learned to decentralize. Awareness expanded outward, while identity shrank inward. This balance, broad perception, minimal self, was optimal. The modern brain still remembers how to do this, not as a conscious strategy, but as a pattern. When night arrives and conditions resemble ancestral darkness, the pattern reactivates. Light fades. Movement slows. Sound loses direction. The nervous system recognizes these cues immediately. It does not wait for conscious interpretation. Hormonal changes begin. Melatonin rises. Cortisol drops. But beneath these chemical shifts is something more subtle, a reversion in scale. The brain stops positioning the self as the focal point of experience. Instead, it returns to an older mode, one where survival depends on blending rather than asserting. This is why the feeling of smallness often carries no fear. Fear would contradict this mode. Fear would sharpen focus and demand action. But the ancestral night did not reward action. It rewarded stillness. Stillness required trust, not in safety, but in patience. The nervous system learned to tolerate long periods of non-intervention, to remain aware without acting. That tolerance is what you feel now as quiet smallness. It is the absence of urgency that once kept humans alive. In a modern context, this memory can feel strange. We are no longer accustomed to darkness without distraction. Artificial light extends the day. Screens recreate feedback loops. Noise fills silence. These inventions keep the self inflated, long past its natural cycle. But when stimulation finally drops, when the night is allowed to be night, the old pattern returns. The mind does not ask permission. It does not check whether this mode is still useful. It simply activates it. This is why the sensation can feel both unfamiliar and deeply natural. You may have never named it, never studied it, never talked about it, but your nervous system has done this before, thousands of times, across lifetimes that did not leave written records. The smallness you feel is not a commentary on your worth. It is a calibration, a reminder encoded in biology that survival does not require being large in consciousness. It requires fitting into the environment without friction. At night, the environment no longer invites interaction, so the self steps back, not in defeat, in alignment. This alignment does not feel triumphant. It feels quiet, neutral, almost invisible, which is exactly how it was meant to feel. The mind that learned to survive the dark did not celebrate smallness. It simply accepted it, and in acceptance, rest became possible. The body could conserve energy. The mind could stop scanning for opportunity. The self could rest without needing to disappear. This ancient rhythm still pulses beneath modern life. It is masked by convenience, by constant stimulation, by the illusion of control, but it has not gone away. Every night, when conditions allow, it resurfaces as a feeling that has no words, as a quiet reduction in the need to be someone, as the sense that existence continues just fine without you standing at its center. And when that realization settles, another layer of the mind begins to stir, one that has less to do with survival or identity and more to do with memory itself, with how the past reshapes itself. When the present no longer insists on being important, memory does not behave the same way at night. This is not a metaphor. It is an observable shift in how the brain retrieves, filters, and weighs the past. During the day, memory is functional. It is accessed for use. What happened before is recalled in service of what must happen next. Memories are ranked. Some are pulled forward, others are suppressed. The self decides which ones matter. At night, this hierarchy collapses. When the sense of self loses dominance, memory loses its organizer. There is no central narrative telling memory what role to play, so memory changes its behavior. Instead of arriving as a sequence, it surfaces as fragments, a sound, a place, a face without context. Not a story, just impressions. These impressions often feel distant, even when they are emotionally charged. A memory that would provoke reaction during the day now arrives muted, not erased, softened. The emotional coloring is reduced because emotion depends on relevance. Relevance depends on identity. When identity thins, emotion loses its anchor. This is why painful memories often feel less sharp at night, not because the mind is avoiding them, but because it is no longer framing them. As part of a personal storyline, they are remembered, but not owned. The brain shifts from narrative memory to sensory memory. Instead of what happened, there is how it felt. Instead of cause and effect, there is atmosphere. This shift is subtle, but profound. Narrative memory requires effort. It requires sequencing, perspective, and evaluation. All of these are energy-intensive processes. At night, the brain conserves energy by allowing memory to exist without explanation. Fragments are cheaper than stories. They do not need to be justified. They do not need to lead anywhere. They can simply appear and dissolve. This is why nighttime memories often feel dreamlike, even before sleep begins. The boundary between memory and imagination grows thin, not because the mind is confused, but because the systems that normally keep them separate are less active. The brain is no longer policing meaning. It allows overlap. A childhood room may blend with a present space. A familiar voice may lose its owner. These blends are not errors. They are signs that memory is being reorganized without narrative constraint. This reorganization is essential for emotional regulation. Memories carry charge. That charge must be processed, not endlessly replayed. At night, when the self steps aside, the brain can handle this charge without triggering defense mechanisms. During the day, a strong memory threatens identity. It reminds you of failure, loss, regret. The self reacts. It resists. It reframes. It defends. At night, there is no defense. The self is too small to feel attacked. So memory is allowed to surface gently, not to be solved, just to be felt. This is why many people experience unexpected memories as they lie in the dark. Not traumatic flashbacks, but ordinary moments, long forgotten. A smell from years ago, a laugh, a particular shade of light. These memories do not demand attention. They drift through awareness. Like weather, the brain is testing how these memories behave when they are not assigned meaning. In this state, memory becomes less about the past and more about integration. Neuroscience describes this as consolidation, but from the inside, it feels like loosening. Memories lose their sharp edges. They stop insisting on interpretation. They stop pulling the self backward. Instead, they float alongside awareness. This is deeply connected to the feeling of smallness. A large self reacts strongly to memory. It sees memory as information about identity. A small self sees memory as experience passing through. No verdict is reached. No conclusion is drawn. The memory does not say, "This is who you are." It simply exists and then fades. This is one of the reasons why night can feel emotionally lighter. Even when difficult memories appear, the weight has been removed. Not from the memory, but from the one carrying it. The brain knows that identity is not required for memory processing. In fact, identity interferes. When the self is strong, memory becomes political. It is sorted into categories: acceptable, unacceptable, useful, threatening. At night, those categories lose meaning. Memory becomes neutral terrain. This neutrality allows long-standing emotional tension to soften, not resolve. Soften. Resolution requires conscious work. Softening requires surrender. And surrender is only possible when the self is not insisting on control. This is why the feeling of smallness often precedes emotional relief, not happiness. Relief. The relief of not having to carry the past actively. The mind is not forgiving. It is resting. Forgiveness implies judgment. Rest does not judge. It allows memory to pass through without commentary. This process cannot be rushed. It cannot be forced. It emerges Only when the environment is quiet, the body feels safe, and the self is not demanding coherence. At night, these conditions align naturally. Memory slips out from under the narrative grip and becomes fluid again. Less personal, less heavy. This fluidity is temporary. By morning, identity will reassemble. Narrative will return. Memory will once again be recruited to support a sense of self. But the nighttime state leaves a trace, a subtle recalibration of emotional tone, a softening that carries into sleep. And in sleep, this reorganization deepens further. But even before sleep arrives, you may notice that the past no longer presses against you with the same insistence. It is still there, but it no longer asks to define you. This is not forgetting. It is perspective without distance. And as memory continues to loosen its hold on narrative, another system begins to respond, one that governs emotion itself, adjusting its intensity when there is no longer a central identity to protect or defend. There is a quiet habit the mind maintains almost constantly. It tells a story, not out loud, not in full sentences, but continuously, a subtle narration running beneath thought, linking moments together into something that feels like me. This story answers questions before they are even asked. Where am I in my life? What does this moment mean for me? How does this connect to who I am becoming? During the day, this narration is relentless. Even when you are not aware of it, it is there, threading experiences into sequence, assigning importance, placing you at the center of events. This narrative is not fiction, but it is not objective either. It is a functional construct designed to keep behavior coherent over time. It gives continuity, direction, identity. At night, this narration begins to falter, not because the mind is tired of telling it, but because there is no longer a reason to continue. Stories exist to explain change. When nothing is changing, story loses momentum. In the stillness of night, events stop unfolding in ways that require interpretation. There are no decisions to justify, no actions to frame, no consequences to anticipate. The narrator pauses. At first, this pause is barely noticeable. The story simply becomes quieter. Gaps appear between thoughts. The mind starts losing track of where it was going. Sentences trail off. This is often the moment people describe as losing their train of thought. But something deeper is happening. The system responsible for maintaining do that bide, a continuous sense of self, is reducing its activity. Narrative selfhood depends on working memory and temporal integration. It requires the mind to hold the recent past and projected future together at once. At night, this integration weakens. The past feels less immediate. The future feels less relevant. Without those anchors, the story cannot continue, so it dissolves. Not dramatically, quietly. The mind does not announce that the story has stopped. It simply stops adding new lines. Awareness remains, but without commentary. This is an unfamiliar state. Most waking experience is filtered through explanation. We rarely notice perception without interpretation. But here, perception stands alone. You hear a sound without asking where it came from. You notice a sensation without naming it. You exist without describing yourself. This absence of narration can feel disorienting. If you are accustomed to constant self-referencing, the mind may briefly search for the story. It may attempt to restart it. Thoughts like, what am I thinking right now? Why do I feel this way? These questions are attempts to reestablish narrative, but without energy, they collapse. The mind lets them go. When narration stops, the sense of being a protagonist vanishes with it. You are no longer in a story. You are simply present. This presence does not feel heroic. It does not feel meaningful in the way stories do. It feels neutral, and neutrality is what allows the feeling of smallness to deepen. Stories make people large. They give weight to action. They elevate consequence. Without story, nothing is elevated. Nothing is framed as significant or insignificant. Things simply are. This is why the night can feel strangely flat, even when it is emotionally calm. The peaks and valleys belong to narrative. When narrative fades, experience smooths out. The self does not disappear here. It becomes unlocated. There is no longer a clear answer to the question, where am I in all this? Because where is a narrative concept. Without sequence, location loses meaning. This is deeply counterintuitive. We are taught that awareness equals self-awareness. But here, awareness exists. Without reflexive identity, you are aware, but not of yourself as a character. This is not unconsciousness. It is consciousness. Without authorship, the mind is no longer signing each experience with a name. This state is often described as blank by people who encounter it for the first time. But blankness implies emptiness. This is not empty. It is unmarked. Nothing is labeled. Nothing is claimed. The reduction in narrative is one of the most restorative processes the mind can undergo. Narrative is effortful. It requires evaluation, comparison, and judgment. These processes consume cognitive resources. At night, those resources are needed elsewhere for repair, for regulation, for integration. The mind cannot perform deep internal work while also maintaining a story. So the story is set aside, not abandoned. Set aside. This is why the feeling of smallness is often accompanied by a sense of quiet relief. You are no longer required to make sense of yourself. You are no longer responsible for continuity. The burden of being someone lifts, if only briefly. This lifting does not produce joy. It produces lightness. Not emotional lightness, but existential lightness. The sense that you are no longer carrying yourself forward. Time flows without needing you to move through it. The world exists without needing your interpretation, and you exist within it without needing explanation. This state cannot be held deliberately. The moment you try to observe it as an experience, the narrator returns. The story restarts. You become someone again. But when allowed to pass naturally, this narrative silence prepares the mind for a deeper shift, one where emotion itself is no longer organized around personal storyline and begins to respond to the body and the present moment without reference to who you are or what has happened to you. When the story about you falls quiet, something else takes its place. Not another voice, not another explanation, a stance. You do not think differently at first. You relate differently. Thoughts still appear. Sensations still move through the body. Emotions still rise and settle, but none of them ask to be claimed. You notice yourself the way you might notice weather, a shift, a temperature, a passing pressure, not as evidence, not as meaning, just as occurrence. This is one of the least familiar positions the human mind can occupy. Most of waking life is lived from inside experience. You are in your thoughts, in your emotions, in your reactions. Even when you reflect as someone. Here, That alignment loosens. You are no longer inside the experience, trying to steer it. You are beside it. This does not happen through intention. It happens when intention has no place to attach. At night, when the narrative self has stepped aside, awareness shifts orientation. Instead of moving forward, it widens. Instead of pushing, it rests. And in resting, it begins to watch. This watching is not analytical. There is no attempt to understand why a thought appears. No effort to change a feeling. Observation here is passive. It does not intervene. You may notice sadness, but it does not feel like your sadness. It feels like sadness passing through a system. You may notice tension in the body, but it does not demand correction. It is simply there, existing without instruction. This separation is often misunderstood as detachment, but detachment implies withdrawal. What is happening here is not withdrawal, but redistribution. The mind is no longer fused with what it perceives. Fusion requires effort. It requires belief that what is happening needs to be acted upon. At night, belief weakens, not skepticism. Belief, the assumption that experience must be responded to. When that assumption dissolves, observation becomes possible. You are not distancing yourself from experience. You are allowing experience to exist without ownership. Ownership is a daytime habit. It is reinforced by consequence. At night, consequence fades. There is nothing at stake. And when nothing is at stake, the mind stops gripping. This is when the observer emerges, not as a separate entity, but as a default mode. When identity loosens, you do not decide to observe yourself. You notice that observation is already happening. This can feel uncanny. You may become aware of your own breathing without controlling it, of your own thoughts without following them, of your own emotions without needing to resolve them. The mind does not rush to label this experience. Labels belong to narrative. Here, narrative is absent, so the experience remains unnamed. This unnamed awareness has no urgency. It does not try to fix. It does not try to improve. It does not evaluate progress. It simply remains present. This presence is what allows the feeling of smallness to stabilize without discomfort. When you stop identifying with every internal movement, there is no reason to feel overwhelmed by them. The self becomes lighter because it is no longer carrying the weight of interpretation. Emotions are heavy only when they are personal. When they are seen as phenomena, they lose mass. This does not mean they lose significance. It means they no longer threaten identity. A strong emotion during the day can feel destabilizing because it disrupts the story. At night, with no story to disrupt, emotion can pass freely. You might notice a wave of feeling rise and fall without consequence. No decision follows. No action is required. The observer does not intervene. This non-intervention is deeply restorative. It allows the nervous system to process signals without escalating them. During the day, self-monitoring amplifies sensation. At night, monitoring fades. Without amplification, signals resolve more quickly. This is why some people report feeling emotionally clearer after simply lying awake in the dark, doing nothing. They did not solve anything. They stopped interfering. The observer state is not productive. It does not generate insight. It does not lead to conclusions. It simply creates space. Space is what allows systems to recalibrate themselves. The body understands this intuitively. When observation replaces control, muscle tension releases further. Breathing deepens again. Heart rate variability increases. These are signals of safety. The system is no longer bracing. The mind is no longer guarding identity. This is why the observer state cannot coexist with fear. Fear demands action. Observation refuses it. If fear appears, the observer either dissolves or fear does. At night, when conditions are right, fear rarely survives long. There is nothing to do with it, no plan to form, no escape to calculate. So it loses momentum. The observer remains. This state also explains why time behaves differently. Without narrative, there is no timeline. Moments do not stack. They simply occur. You may lose track of how long you have been awake, not because you are distracted, but because duration requires reference points. The observer does not measure. Measurement is a form of control. Here, control is unnecessary. This is not meditation. Meditation is intentional. This is incidental. It arises naturally. When the self is no longer reinforced, the observer does not claim authority. It does not feel superior. It does not feel enlightened. It feels ordinary, almost boring. And that ordinariness is precisely what makes it safe. There is no pressure to stay here, no achievement associated with it. You can leave at any moment by thinking a thought with urgency. The self will reassemble instantly. But if you do not, the observer continues quietly, watching the mind unwind itself. This unwinding is not something you direct. It happens on its own. Memory softens further. Emotion reorganizes. Bodily rhythms synchronize, all without commentary. The observer does not guide this process. It allows it. Allowance is the key. Not effort, not insight. Allowance. This allowance is what allows sleep to eventually take over. Sleep does not arrive through force. It arrives when observation no longer needs to remain conscious, when even watching becomes unnecessary. But before that happens, this quiet witnessing serves as a bridge between being someone and being no one in particular, between carrying identity and letting it rest, between wakefulness and whatever comes next. There is a moment that does not last long. Most people pass through it without realizing it ever occurred. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It leaves no clear memory behind. And yet, this is the moment when the sense of self is thinnest, not gone, not erased, just barely there. Earlier, the observer was present. Awareness watched. Thoughts and sensations moved through the mind. There was still a position. Someone was watching. But now, even that position begins to soften. Observation no longer feels active. It no longer feels like a stance you are holding. It feels like something that is happening on its own. The difference is subtle, but profound. You are no longer aware of yourself observing. There is just awareness. No watcher, no watched. This is where language starts to fail completely, because language depends on separation, subject and object, cause and effect. Here, those distinctions blur, not philosophically, experientially. You may still hear sounds, but you do not register that you are hearing them. You may still feel the body, but it does not feel owned. The sense of, this is happening to me, is replaced by, this is happening, and even that formulation is already too much. Thought is slow here, not sluggish. Sparse thoughts appear, with long gaps between them. They do not connect. They do not develop. They appear, hang for a moment, and dissolve before they can turn into anything. This is often the point where people fear they are losing consciousness. But consciousness is still present. It is simply no longer structured around identity. The brain has reached a threshold state. Executive control is almost fully offline. The systems responsible for self-referential processing are quiet, but sensory awareness remains. The body still regulates itself. Breathing continues. Heart rate adjusts. Temperature shifts. The organism is active. The person is not. This distinction is deeply unsettling to a mind trained to equate selfhood with existence. We assume that to exist, we must be someone. Here, that assumption dissolves. Existence continues without commentary, without identity, without importance. This is the smallest a human being feels while still awake, not because they are diminished, but because nothing is being added. No interpretation, no evaluation, no framing, just raw presence. This presence does not feel meaningful. Meaning requires comparison. There is nothing to compare here. It does not feel empty either. Emptiness implies lack. There is no sense of lack. There is simply no sense of self-reference. The mind has stopped asking where it is. In relation to anything, it has stopped placing itself on a map. Maps require perspective. Perspective requires identity. Without identity, orientation dissolves. This is why the experience can feel like floating, not moving upward, just unanchored. But even floating implies movement. Here, there is no movement, only continuation. Many people later describe this moment as peaceful. Others describe it as unsettling. The difference does not lie in the experience itself. It lies in resistance. If the mind attempts to reassert identity, to think about the experience, the moment collapses. The self snaps back into place. Thought resumes. Narrative restarts. And the feeling is lost. But if no resistance appears, the state stabilizes briefly. Not long enough to become familiar. Just long enough to allow transition. This is the doorway between waking and sleep. Not the doorway of unconsciousness, but the doorway where identity is no longer required for awareness to continue. Sleep does not arrive by force. It arrives because identity steps aside. The system no longer needs a coordinator. Processes that were waiting for silence begin to move. Memory consolidation deepens. Sensory gating tightens. External input is deprioritized. Internal rhythms take precedence. All of this happens without direction. The organism knows how to do this. It has always known. The smallness you feel here is not existential despair. It is existential neutrality. You are not nothing. You are simply not centered. The world does not orbit you, but it does not oppose you either. Orbit and opposition require a self. Here, there is none to engage with. This is why even fear struggles to survive here. Fear requires a subject to protect. When the subject thins, fear loses its target. It may flicker briefly, but without identity, it cannot organize itself. So it fades. What remains is a quiet continuity that feels oddly familiar, as if the mind has returned to a state it once knew, but forgot how to name. This state is not sustainable. In waking life, it would make functioning impossible. But as a passage, as a threshold, it is essential. It is how the mind lets go of the day, not by reviewing it, not by resolving it, but by making the self too small to carry it any further. And as this thinning reaches its limit, something changes again, not in awareness, but in how emotion itself behaves. When there is no longer a self to attach to, no narrative to feed, no identity to defend. The moment of smallest self does not feel the same to every person. The sensation itself is remarkably consistent. The thinning of identity, the loss of narrative, the quiet continuation of awareness without a center, but the reaction to that sensation varies widely. Some people sink into it without resistance. Others tense, even though nothing is happening. Some feel comfort. Others feel unease. This difference does not come from the night. It comes from the structure of the self that existed before the night arrived. During the day, identity is not built evenly. Some selves are flexible. Others are rigid. Some are lightweight, able to loosen and reassemble without strain. Others are dense, held together by constant effort. The night does not create these differences. It reveals them. For a person whose daytime identity is loosely held, smallness feels familiar, not because it is remembered, but because it does not threaten stability. The self can shrink without fear of collapse. There is trust that it will return. For someone whose identity is tightly controlled, smallness can feel dangerous, not because it is harmful, but because it interrupts control. Control is not comfort. Control is defense. A tightly controlled self has learned to survive by staying defined. Clear roles, clear goals, clear internal hierarchy. When that hierarchy dissolves, the system does not recognize rest. It recognizes uncertainty, and uncertainty is often mistaken for threat. This is why two people lying in identical rooms under identical conditions can have opposite experiences of night. One drifts, the other resists. The difference lies in how much the self depends on continuity. Some identities are narrative heavy. They require constant explanation. Who I am, what I am doing, why this matters. These questions must be answered continuously for the self to feel intact. When night removes the conditions that make answers possible, the system reacts, not with panic, but with vigilance. Thoughts accelerate. The mind searches for something to hold, a concern, a plan, a memory with weight, anything that can restore a sense of centrality. This is often misinterpreted as overthinking, but it is not thinking for understanding. It is thinking for structure. The mind is attempting to rebuild the self in an environment that no longer supports it. For others, identity is less narrative dependent. It is held more in sensation than in story. These individuals often experience night as a relief, not because life is easy, but because identity is allowed to rest. The self does not need to be defended when it is not being evaluated. This flexibility often develops unconsciously. It is shaped by temperament, by early environment, by how safety was learned. A nervous system that learned safety through stillness will tolerate smallness easily. A nervous system that learned safety through control will struggle with it. Neither approach is wrong. They are adaptations. The night simply removes the scaffolding that hides these adaptations during the day. This is why people who appear confident and capable during waking hours sometimes struggle the most. At night, their identity functions well in structured environments, but structure disappears in darkness. The self is left unsupported, and unsupported structures strain. Other people who feel uncertain during the day may feel unexpectedly calm at night because uncertainty is no longer contrasted against expectation. There is no performance to maintain. The field is level. This inversion confuses many people. They expect night to amplify their daytime self. Instead, it often exposes its mechanics. The feeling of smallness is the point of exposure. It shows how much effort the self usually requires. Some selves are light. They shrink without friction. Others are heavy. They resist compression. Resistance does not indicate weakness. It indicates dependence. Dependence on being someone. Dependence on relevance. Dependence on continuity. When those supports are removed, the system reacts by trying to restore them. This restoration effort is what creates discomfort, not the smallness itself. Smallness is neutral. Discomfort arises when the mind believes it should not be small. This belief is rarely conscious. It is embedded in habit, in the way attention is trained, in the way worth is measured, in the way existence is justified. Many people are taught, explicitly or implicitly, that to exist is to contribute, to matter, to be seen. When night removes the stage on which these conditions are met, the mind becomes restless. It looks for the stage, but there is no stage. There is only darkness, stillness, and continuation. For some, this is freedom. For others, this is exposure. Exposure to the fact that the self is not always necessary. This realization can feel humiliating to an identity built on centrality, not because it is untrue, but because it contradicts how value has been experienced. The night does not judge. It does not care whether you are important. It does not reward effort. It simply removes feedback. And without feedback, the mind must decide how to exist. Some choose to let go. Others choose to tighten. Both are understandable. But only one allows rest. Rest is not passive. It requires trust. Trust that identity can be paused without being lost. Trust that existence does not require constant self-definition. People who struggle with night often believe they must stay awake to protect something. Their thoughts circle, not because there is danger, but because there is attachment. Attachment to being someone, even when nothing is asking for it. This attachment is not pathological. It is learned. In environments where unpredictability existed, control was survival. The self learned to stay awake, to stay alert, to stay defined. Night challenges this strategy. It asks the self to dissolve without proof of safety. For some systems, this feels impossible. For others, it feels natural. The difference is not strength. It is history. And history lives in the nervous system, not in belief. This is why telling someone to relax at night rarely works. Relaxation cannot be commanded. When identity feels threatened, the system must feel that nothing depends on it. Night attempts to communicate this by removing demand. If the message is received, smallness feels gentle. If the message is resisted, smallness feels unsettling. But the message does not change. It repeats every night in silence, without explanation. And over time, even resistant systems may begin to soften, not through understanding, but through repetition. The nervous system learns that nothing breaks. When identity shrinks, that consciousness continues, that existence does not collapse. This learning is slow. It does not arrive as insight. It arrives as reduced resistance. One night, the mind fights less. Another night, even less, until eventually, smallness no longer feels like a threat. It feels like a signal that the day has ended. That effort is no longer required. That being someone can wait. And as this signal becomes familiar, another shift begins. One where the question is no longer, why does this feel uncomfortable? But rather, Why did it ever feel threatening at all? A question that does not seek an answer, but slowly dissolves as the system learns that safety does not depend on scale, on identity, or on being at the center of anything. When something unfamiliar happens inside the mind, the first instinct is often to judge it. Is this normal? Is this healthy? Is something wrong with me? The feeling of smallness at night invites these questions, precisely because it resists categorization. It does not announce itself as distress. It does not arrive with a clear emotional label. It simply alters scale. And in a culture that equates clarity with safety, anything that blurs boundaries is quickly suspected. Many people quietly wonder whether this experience is a warning sign, a sign of depression, of dissociation, of existential despair. But the body tells a different story. When this state appears naturally, the physiological signals do not align with threat. Heart rate slows, breathing deepens, muscle tension decreases. The nervous system moves toward parasympathetic dominance, the branch associated with rest, repair, and safety. This alone is significant. The body does not enter restorative mode in the presence of danger. If the mind were breaking down, the body would mobilize. It would prepare for action. But here, it prepares for rest. That preparation is not subtle. It is measurable, which tells us something essential. This state is not pathology. It is regulation. The confusion arises because the experience does not match what we are taught to expect from feeling okay. We expect comfort to feel reassuring. We expect mental health to feel stable, defined, grounded. Smallness feels none of these things. It feels undefined, but undefined does not mean unstable. It means unforced. In cognitive terms, this state represents a reduction in self-referential processing. The brain temporarily deprioritizes the networks that generate self-evaluation and identity maintenance. These networks are not shut down. They are simply not dominant. This is important. In depression, self-referential networks often become overactive. Thoughts turn inward, looping endlessly around worth, failure, and loss. Smallness does the opposite. It reduces inward focus. It dissolves the sense that the self must be continuously assessed. There is no rumination here. Thoughts slow. Loops break. The mind is not trapped inside itself. It is released from itself. This is why the state often feels quiet rather than heavy. Even when it is unfamiliar, it is rarely oppressive. Oppression requires pressure. Smallness removes pressure. It is also not dissociation. Dissociation is a protective response to overwhelming stress. It creates distance to avoid pain. In dissociation, the body often feels unreal. Sensations are dulled. The nervous system is braced, not relaxed. Smallness does not dull sensation. It clarifies it. Sounds may feel sharper, textures more noticeable. The world is not distant. It is simply not personal. This distinction matters. Dissociation pulls you away from experience. Smallness places you within experience. Without assigning ownership, you are not cut off. You are not numbed. You are simply no longer central. Existential despair is another common misinterpretation. Despair carries meaning. It says, nothing matters. Smallness does not say this. It says nothing at all. Meaninglessness is a conclusion. Smallness is preconceptual. It arrives before conclusions, before judgments, before interpretation. This is why it can feel difficult to talk about. The mind wants to explain it, but explanation would distort it. Smallness is not a belief. It is a condition, a condition where belief is temporarily irrelevant. This irrelevance can be mistaken for nihilism, but nihilism is active. It argues, it rejects. Smallness does not argue. It does not reject meaning. It simply does not require it. This is closer to how consciousness functions in non-problem-solving states. Infant, before identity forms. Animals, outside of threat. Humans, just before sleep. These states are not broken. They are foundational. The difficulty arises because modern identity is built on constant self-reference. We are taught that to be mentally healthy is to be coherent, consistent, and self-aware at all times. But coherence is a tool, not a requirement. It is useful when navigating complexity. It is unnecessary when nothing needs to be navigated. Night reduces complexity. So the tool is set down. Setting down a tool can feel like loss. If you forget that it was only a tool, the fear that something is wrong often comes from resistance. The mind expects itself to remain intact, alert, and defined. When it doesn't, alarm bells ring. But these bells are cognitive, not biological. The body is calm. The mind is quiet. Only expectation is violated. And expectation is not a reliable indicator of danger. In fact, expectation is often the source of discomfort. We expect to feel like someone. When we don't, we assume something is missing. But what is missing is effort. The effort to maintain identity. Identity is not free. It requires energy. At night, the brain conserves energy by reducing that effort. This is not failure. It is efficiency. The system is optimizing for restoration, not performance. This optimization is invisible during the day because performance is required. At night, performance is irrelevant, so the system reconfigures. It does so quietly, without announcement, without asking permission. Because it has done this, for as long as there have been nights, the modern mind is simply unused to noticing it. Many people only notice because the contrast is stark. Daytime identity is loud. Nighttime identity is soft. The transition feels abrupt, even when it is gradual. This contrast creates the illusion of malfunction. But contrast does not imply error. It implies difference. And difference is the foundation of rhythm. Waking and sleeping are not opposites. They are phases. So are largeness and smallness. The self expands. When action is required, it contracts. When action is unnecessary, this contraction is not optional. It is biological. Resisting it creates tension. Allowing it creates rest. The question, then, is not whether smallness is bad. It is whether resisting it is useful. For some, resistance feels safer. They cling to identity because it has protected them. But night offers a different kind of safety. Not safety through control, but safety through irrelevance. Nothing depends on you right now. Nothing is waiting. Nothing will fall apart. If you are not present, this message is difficult for an identity built on responsibility. But it is a truthful message. The world does not pause. When you rest, it does not need you to keep turning. Recognizing this does not diminish your value. It relieves you of unnecessary burden. Smallness is not the opposite of worth. It is the absence of measurement. Worth is a daytime concern. At night, the system does not measure. It balances. And balance does not require judgment. It requires release. This release is what prepares the mind for the deeper stages of rest to come, not by resolving life, but by suspending the need to be someone in it and As the system becomes accustomed to this suspension, the question quietly shifts away from, "Is this wrong?" towards something gentler, almost curious. What happens if I don't fight it at all? A question that does not demand an answer, but slowly dissolves as the nervous system learns, night after night, that nothing terrible follows. When the self becomes small, and that sometimes smallness is not a problem to be solved, but a condition that allows everything else to finally rest. There is a specific fear that rarely speaks its name. It does not sound like panic. It does not feel like dread. It hides behind vigilance, behind thinking, behind alertness, behind the need to stay awake just a little longer. This fear is not of the night itself. It is the fear of losing control of the self. Control, in this sense, does not mean discipline or strength. It means continuity, the belief that I must remain intact, recognizable, and present for existence to be safe. During the day, this belief is constantly reinforced. You act, and the world responds. You make choices, and outcomes follow. This feedback loop creates the illusion that identity is necessary for stability. At night, that loop weakens, and when it does, control feels negotiable. This is where resistance begins. The mind tightens, not because something is wrong, but because something familiar is dissolving. The self senses that it is no longer required to manage the moment. And for many identities, this feels unacceptable, not because the self enjoys control, but because control has been equated with safety. The nervous system learns early what keeps it alive. For some, safety came from stillness. For others, from vigilance. If vigilance kept danger away, the self learned to stay alert, to stay defined, to remain present, even when nothing was happening. Night challenges this strategy. It removes threats without removing uncertainty. There is nothing to respond to, but also nothing to confirm that everything is fine. This ambiguity is intolerable to a system trained on control, so the mind fills the space. It thinks, not to solve a problem, but to prevent dissolution. Thought becomes a tether. As long as the mind is thinking, the self feels anchored. The content of the thoughts does not matter. Worry works just as well as planning. Regret works just as well as analysis. Any thought with urgency restores the feeling of being someone. This is why night thinking often feels circular. It is not trying to reach a conclusion. It is trying to stay intact. The fear underneath is not that something bad will happen. It is that no one will be there to respond. If something does, this fear is rarely conscious. It does not present itself as a clear statement. It manifests as restlessness, as discomfort with silence, as the need to check, to scroll, to listen to something that keeps the self engaged. Engagement maintains scale. As long as the mind is engaged, the self remains large enough to feel in control. But control at night is an illusion. There is nothing to control. The body is regulating itself. Breathing happens. Heart rate adjusts. Temperature stabilizes. The organism does not require supervision, but identity believes it does. This belief is deeply ingrained. Modern life rewards constant monitoring of performance, of progress, of relevance. We are taught that stepping away invites collapse. So when the night asks for stepping away, the self resists, not out of stubbornness, out of habit. Habit built from survival strategies that once made sense. The irony is that this resistance creates the very discomfort it is trying to avoid. Smallness itself is neutral. Resistance to smallness produces tension. The more the self insists on staying present, the more effort is required. Effort at night feels exhausting. The mind grows tired, but refuses to rest. This creates a feedback loop. Fatigue increases. Control weakens. Fear of losing control rises. So the self tightens further. This tightening is often misread as anxiety. But anxiety has direction. It points to something. Here, there is no object, just a refusal to let go of authorship. The fear is not, what if something happens? It is, what if I am not here when it does? This reveals a deep assumption that identity must remain awake for the organism to remain safe. But this assumption is false. Sleep exists precisely because the organism does not require identity to function. The brain has layers. Identity is only one of them, and it is not the most fundamental. At night, the deeper layers prepare to take over, but they cannot, while identity insists on managing. So the system signals for identity to step aside. It does so gently at first, by reducing relevance, by kidding narrative, by softening emotion. If these signals are ignored, the system escalates. Fatigue deepens. Thought becomes less coherent. The self feels unstable. This instability is often interpreted as danger, but it is simply the result of competing modes. Waking identity is trying to remain active. In a state designed for rest, the fear of losing control is understandable. Identity has been useful. It has navigated complexity. It has protected boundaries. It has ensured continuity. Letting it go feels like betrayal. But night is not asking for abandonment. It is asking for suspension. Identity does not die at night. It rests. The difficulty is that resting identity feels like disappearance. To a system unused to rest, we do not practice being without self during the day. We practice being efficient, being responsive, being defined. So when the opportunity to not be these things arises, the system panics slightly, not loudly, quietly, as vigilance, as thought, as resistance to stillness. The fear is reinforced by language. We speak of losing ourselves as something tragic. We speak of staying grounded as something virtuous. But grounding implies weight. Night asks for lightness. Grounding resists floating. Floating is precisely what the system needs to transition. This does not mean control is bad. It means control has a rhythm. It is necessary in some contexts and unnecessary in others. Night is a context where control interferes. The body knows this. The mind resists it. This conflict is felt as discomfort, not because smallness is wrong, but because identity is afraid of becoming irrelevant. Relevance has become a stand-in for safety. At night, the system attempts to teach a different lesson, that safety can exist without relevance. Nothing depends on you right now, and nothing will break. Because of that, this lesson cannot be taught through explanation. It must be felt repeatedly. Night after night, the system offers the same invitation. Let go of control. Not forever, just for now. Those who accept this invitation do not disappear. They sleep. Those who refuse remain awake, holding themselves together in a moment that does not require it. Over time, even resistant systems may begin to trust that nothing terrible follows. When control loosens, that identity returns every morning, unharmed, intact, ready to function again. This trust does not arrive as belief. It arrives as reduced effort. The self tightens less. The mind thinks less urgently. Silence becomes tolerable. Eventually, the fear of losing control loses its grip, not because it is disproven, but because it is no longer needed. And when control is no longer defended, the system is free to move into a different mode, one where letting go is not experienced as loss, but as alignment, where the absence of control is not a threat, but a signal that the organism is finally allowed to stop managing itself, and where the question is no longer, what am I afraid of losing? But simply, what happens when nothing is being held at all? There is a point where resistance does not end dramatically. It simply runs out of energy. No decision is made. No conclusion is reached. The mind does not say, I will stop holding on now. It just cannot continue. This is not collapse. Collapse is sudden. Collapse is violent. What happens here is quieter. Effort thins. The muscles of attention relax without permission. The grip loosens because there is nothing left to grip with. Earlier, the self was defended. Thoughts were used as anchors. Control was maintained through vigilance. But vigilance is expensive, and night is long. Eventually, the nervous system chooses efficiency over persistence. It chooses rest over coherence. This choice is not conscious. It is biological. The brain does not argue with fatigue. It responds to it. As effort drops, something subtle changes. In the body first, breathing deepens again. Not intentionally, but rhythmically. The exhale grows longer. The chest softens. The body stops preparing for movement. This physical shift sends a message upward. Nothing is required. The mind hears this message, not as words, but as permission. Permission to stop holding shape. This is the moment, often described as letting go, though nothing is actually released. What happens is that nothing is being held anymore. The difference matters. Letting go implies action. Here, there is no action. There is absence of effort. The self does not step aside. It dissolves because it is no longer sustained. This dissolution is not frightening. Fear needs tension. When tension leaves, fear loses its structure. What remains is a kind of neutrality that feels heavier than alertness, but lighter than sleep. The mind is still awake, but it is no longer working. This is rest without unconsciousness, rest without escape, rest without identity. The body recognizes this state immediately. Heart rate variability increases. The nervous system shifts fully into recovery mode. The signals that once demanded attention are deprioritized. The brain no longer scans for relevance. It stops asking, what matters? Not because nothing matters, but because nothing needs to matter right now. This is the difference between rest and distraction. Distraction keeps the self active by giving it something to orbit. Rest removes the orbit entirely. There is nothing to revolve around. This can feel strange because most people associate rest with comfort or pleasure. This state is neither. It is simply absence of demand. No push, no pull, just continuation. The mind may still register sounds or sensations, but they arrive without triggering response. A sound happens. No interpretation follows. A sensation arises. No correction is made. The system has stopped intervening. Intervention is a daytime habit. It is the act of adjusting oneself in response to perceived requirement. At night, the requirement disappears, and with it, the need to intervene. This is why the body often feels heavier right before sleep, not because it is sinking, but because it is no longer being held. Muscles relax past the point they normally reach. Posture gives way to gravity. The organism accepts its own weight. This acceptance is deeply calming to the nervous system. The mind follows. Thoughts lose momentum, not because they are suppressed, but because they no longer connect. One thought appears, then nothing, then another, unrelated, then nothing again. The gaps widen. In those gaps, there is no one waiting. Awareness remains, but it has no project. This is where many people mistake the experience for boredom, but boredom requires wanting something to happen. Here, there is no wanting. There is only allowance. Allowance is the absence of resistance to what is already occurring, and what is occurring is very little. This is why the mind sometimes tries one last time to reassert itself. A sudden thought, a memory with emotional charge, a concern that feels important. These are not signs that rest is failing. They are remnants, echoes of identity, testing whether it is still needed. If engaged, the self reassembles. If ignored, the echoes fade, not because they are resolved, but because they are unnecessary. The system is transitioning from a mode that requires identity to one that does not. This transition cannot be forced. It must be allowed. And allowance comes only when resistance ends. Resistance ends, not through understanding, but through fatigue. Eventually, the self cannot hold itself up anymore. And in that moment, something unexpected happens. Nothing breaks. Awareness continues. The body continues. Time continues. The feared disappearance does not occur. This is the learning moment, not intellectual, somatic. The nervous system learns. That identity is optional. That existence does not depend on self-maintenance. That letting go does not equal loss. This learning is subtle. It does not register as insight. It registers as relief, not happiness. Relief. The relief of no longer having to be someone for a little while. This relief is the gateway to deeper rest. Not sleep yet. Sleep will come when even awareness is allowed to dim. But before that, there is this pause, this resting place where the mind is awake enough to notice that nothing is required of it, where the body is calm enough to proceed without supervision, where the self is small enough to be irrelevant. This is the point where the night finally succeeds in what it has been attempting since darkness fell, not to shut you down, but to remove you from the center of the process, so the deeper systems can do their work without interruption. And as those systems begin to move, as internal rhythms align, without identity guiding them, another subtle shift approaches. One where rest is no longer something you experience, but something that happens without you being there to notice it, as awareness itself prepares to loosen further, and the final boundary between wakefulness and sleep grows thin enough to dissolve without resistance. Sleep does not begin where wakefulness ends. That is the first misunderstanding. We imagine sleep as a switch, a sudden absence, one moment present, the next moment gone. But nothing in biology works that way. What we call sleep is not an event. It is a continuation of the same movement that began hours earlier, when relevance first softened, when identity first lost its urgency, when the self began to shrink. Without resistance, by the time sleep arrives, The work is already mostly done. The self has been stepping aside. For a long time, sleep simply finishes the process. Earlier, identity loosened. Then narrative fell quiet. Then observation replaced control. Then even observation thinned. Now, what remains is awareness without assignment. This is the state from which sleep emerges naturally. Sleep does not erase awareness. It removes the need for awareness to stay present. The brain does not shut down. It redirects. It reallocates resources away from consciousness and toward integration. Integration requires silence, not silence of sound, but silence of self-reference. The self is noisy. It evaluates, it compares, it monitors. These processes interfere with the brain's deeper rhythms. So before sleep can take over, the self must be made small enough to stop interfering. This is why sleep often fails to arrive. When the self remains large, a large self keeps asking questions. Is this enough rest? Am I doing this right? Why am I still awake? Each question reinflates identity. Each reinflation pulls the system backward. Sleep cannot coexist with a self that insists on being involved. This is not punishment. It is mechanics. The brain cannot enter its restorative modes, while identity remains active. So it waits. It continues to reduce input. It dims sensory processing further. External sounds lose their edges. Internal sensations become vague. The world grows distant, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer needed. For orientation, the brain begins to operate in slow rhythms. These rhythms do not support selfhood. They support coordination. Neural networks that have nothing to do with identity take the lead. Memory consolidation deepens. Emotional tone resets. Metabolic processes accelerate. All of this requires minimal interference from conscious control. The self, already small, becomes unnecessary. And when something is unnecessary, biology does not destroy it. It ignores it. This ignoring is what we experience as falling asleep. Not loss, but irrelevance. You do not disappear. You are no longer consulted. The organism continues without commentary. This is why the last moments before sleep often feel indistinct. They do not leave memory. Memory formation requires a narrative anchor, but narrative is gone. So the moment passes without record. From the inside, it feels like nothing happened. From the outside, a great deal happened. The mind reorganized itself without asking who you are. The self, once central, became peripheral, then optional, then absent from the process entirely. This absence is not emptiness. It is efficiency. Sleep is the most efficient state the brain can enter for restoration. Efficiency demands simplicity. Simplicity demands the removal of unnecessary structures. Identity is one such structure, useful when awake, obstructive when resting. So it is set aside, not eliminated. Set aside. This is why sleep feels so different from unconsciousness caused by force. Anesthesia shuts systems down. Sleep reorganizes them. In sleep, the brain is active, sometimes more active than when awake. But activity is no longer organized around the self. It is organized around the body. The organism becomes the unit of concern, not the person. This distinction matters. During the day, you experience life as a person. At night, life continues as an organism. The shift is gradual, and smallness is the bridge between these modes. Smallness allows the transition without rupture. If identity vanished suddenly, the system would resist. There would be fear, there would be alarm. But because identity is reduced in stages, because it shrinks gently, the system does not panic. It adapts. Each stage of smallness teaches the nervous system that less self is still safe, that awareness can continue without authorship, that rest does not require explanation. By the time sleep arrives, this lesson has been learned well enough to allow consciousness itself to step aside. This stepping aside is not something you do. It is something that happens when nothing is preventing it. People often ask how to fall asleep faster. The answer is rarely found in technique. Technique keeps the self active. The more you try to sleep, the more the self stays involved. Sleep arrives when trying becomes unnecessary, when the self is no longer asking to be included. Smallness is the precondition for that exclusion. Not exclusion as rejection, but exclusion as redundancy. The system no longer needs a manager. It needs space. This is why nights, when you feel small, often lead to deeper sleep, even if falling asleep took time. The quality of rest is not determined by speed. It is determined by surrender. Not surrender to sleep, but surrender of identity. The mind must stop insisting on witnessing its own rest. Once it does, rest happens naturally. Sleep is not something you enter. It is something that continues. Once you stop interfering, the feeling of smallness is not an obstacle to sleep. It is the signal that the system is ready, that the self has been sufficiently reduced, that nothing else needs to be done. This is why resisting smallness often delays sleep. Resistance keeps the self large, and a large self cannot be ignored. Sleep requires that the self be ignorable. The night does not ask you to disappear. It asks you to become unnecessary. And when that happens, when identity is stepped aside far enough that awareness no longer demands to remain present, sleep arrives without ceremony, without announcement, without memory. From your perspective, nothing happens. From the system's perspective, everything finally can. And in this quiet continuation, where smallness has done its work and rest has taken over, the rhythm of expansion and contraction completes another cycle, a cycle that will reverse itself. When morning returns, when relevance slowly rebuilds, when identity begins to reassemble, and when the self grows again to meet a world that once more will ask something of it. Smallness does not belong to the night alone. That is the final misunderstanding before the picture becomes whole. The night does not invent this state. It reveals it. What you feel after dark is not a deviation from how the mind should function. It is the counterweight to how the mind is forced to function. During the day, human consciousness is not designed to remain expanded indefinitely. Expansion is useful. It allows action, decision, agency, impact. But expansion without contraction leads to strain. Every system that grows must also release. Muscles tighten and then soften. Breath draws in and then lets go. Attention narrows and then widens. Identity is no different. During the day, identity expands aggressively. It must. You are required to be someone. Someone with a name. Someone with responsibilities. Someone whose actions have consequences. The self grows. To meet those demands, it sharpens its edges. It becomes louder, more defined, more central. This expansion feels natural because It is rewarded. Action produces outcome. Presence produces feedback. The world reflects you back to yourself constantly. Every reflection reinforces scale. You begin to feel that this size is who you are. But it is not. It is a posture, a posture adopted, in response to demand. When demand disappears, posture must change. The night enforces this change, not as correction, but as balance. Without the night, identity would remain perpetually inflated. Inflation is unstable. It requires constant input to sustain. When input stops, the structure strains. This strain is what many people feel as burnout, as exhaustion without clear cause, as the sense that even rest does not restore, because rest that does not allow contraction is not rest. It is maintenance. The night offers contraction. It does not negotiate. It does not explain. It removes conditions that support expansion and allows the system to find its smaller shape. This smaller shape is not inferior. It is efficient. It is the size at which internal processes can operate without interference. At this scale, the mind no longer needs to justify itself. It does not need to perform coherence. It does not need to prove relevance. It simply continues. This continuation is the hidden purpose of the feeling you have been following throughout this recording. Smallness is not a problem to be interpreted. It is a signal that the system is recalibrating. During the day, the mind exaggerates itself to interact with complexity. At night, it reduces itself to recover from that exaggeration. Neither state is more true. They are complementary. The mistake is believing that one should replace the other. Modern life encourages permanence, permanent alertness, permanent relevance, permanent self-awareness. But permanence is not sustainable. The nervous system was not built for constant centrality. Centrality is metabolically expensive. It requires continuous prediction, evaluation, and adjustment. At night, those costs must be paid down. The system does this by reducing scale. Smallness is the mind's way of returning to baseline, not baseline as emptiness, but baseline as neutrality. Neutrality is not numbness. It is absence of bias, absence of pressure. In neutrality, internal systems can communicate without being overridden by narrative demands. This is why nights, where you feel small, often precede days that feel clearer, not happier, clearer. The mind wakes with less residual tension. Decisions feel less charged. Problems feel more proportionate. This is not coincidence. It is the result of a full cycle completing itself. Expansion followed by contraction. Action followed by release. Identity followed by irrelevance. The mind needs both to remain healthy, but only one is socially reinforced. No one congratulates you for becoming small. No one praises you for losing centrality. Yet without this phase, the other phases fail. You cannot expand indefinitely without breaking coherence. You cannot remain important without becoming fragile. The night protects you from this fragility by removing importance entirely. This removal is not an insult. It is maintenance. Think of it not as being diminished, but as being unburdened. During the day, you carry yourself. At night, you are set down. Being set down feels strange if you are used to holding yourself upright, but the floor has always been there. The support does not disappear. When you stop standing, it reveals itself. This is why the feeling of smallness often carries a subtle sense of relief, even when it is unsettling. Part of the system recognizes that something essential has been removed, not meaning weight that was never meant to be carried constantly. This relief is not emotional. It is physiological. The nervous system registers reduced load. Reduced load allows recalibration. Blood pressure adjusts. Hormonal cycles rebalance. Neural networks reset their thresholds. All of this happens without identity overseeing it. Identity would interfere. It would ask, why? It would demand explanation. But explanation is not needed here. Balance does not require insight. It requires rhythm. The night provides rhythm by forcing the opposite of what the day requires. Day, assert. Night, recede. Day, matter. Night, be irrelevant. Day, the Night, allow. Neither is superior, but only together do they form a complete cycle. When people struggle with night, it is often because their daytime identity has been allowed to grow without limit. The self becomes too rigid, too central, too indispensable. Night threatens this construction, not maliciously, naturally. The discomfort is not proof that something is wrong. It is proof that the system has been out of balance. Smallness is the corrective. It is the body saying, enough expansion for now. This correction does not happen once. It happens every night, or at least it tries to. Artificial light, constant stimulation, and internal resistance often interrupt it. But when it succeeds, the system resets, not to zero, to proportion. Proportion is what is lost. When identity remains large too long, everything becomes personal. Every delay feels like a threat. Every problem feels existential. At night, when the self shrinks, problems lose their drama, not because they vanish, but because they are resized. This resizing is not intellectual. You do not reason yourself into better perspective. Perspective emerges when identity is no longer dominating. This is why advice rarely helps at night. Advice keeps the self active. Night does not want advice. It wants quiet. It wants reduction. It wants the system to return to a state where nothing is overemphasized. This return is the essence of restoration, not comfort. Balance. Balance does not feel good or bad. It feels stable. Smallness is stability returning. The self finds its appropriate size for a world that is no longer asking it to act. And in finding that size, the mind completes its cycle. The work of the night is not sleep. Sleep is only the visible outcome. The real work is resizing, adjusting scale so that the next expansion does not tear the system apart. By the time morning arrives, this work will already be done. You will not remember it. Memory requires narrative. Narrative was absent, but the effect will remain in how the world feels manageable again, in how the self feels less brittle, in how being someone feels possible again without strain. Smallness is what makes this possible, not as an experience to cherish, but as a function to respect. It is the night's way of giving back what the day takes, not by adding anything, by subtracting excess. And when this subtraction is complete enough, when balance has been restored without the self needing to oversee the process, something else becomes apparent, not as a thought, not as a realization, but as a quiet readiness, a sense that the cycle is about to turn again, that relevance will slowly rebuild, that identity will quietly return, not because it was lost, but because it was allowed to rest long enough to be useful again. By now, nothing needs to be explained. Explanation belongs to the part of the mind that is already resting. Words remain, but they are no longer trying to hold anything together. They drift the way breath does when no one is counting it. The night has already done what it needed to do. It has reduced scale. It has softened edges. It has removed the need to be someone in particular. What remains is not insight, not understanding, not meaning, just continuation. The world does not pause because you have become quiet. It never needed your permission. Sound still occurs. Time still moves. The body still regulates itself with precision that does not require attention. You are not holding any of this. You are not directing it, and nothing is wrong. Because of that, this is the simplest state the system can occupy while still being awake, not alert, not unconscious, just present, without emphasis. The feeling of smallness is no longer something you notice. It has become the background, like gravity, only felt when resisted. Now, there is no resistance. Thought may appear, but it does not attach. It passes, the way sound passes, through a room that no one is standing in. Memory does not reach forward. Expectation does not reach ahead. The future is not being prepared. The past is not being reviewed. There is no timeline to stand on. Only this moment, which does not ask to be marked. If there is emotion, it is faint, not because it is suppressed, but because it is not fed. Emotion needs narrative to grow. Narrative has already thinned beyond usefulness. What remains does not want resolution. Resolution implies a problem. There is no problem here, only rhythm. Breath in, breath out, not observed, not controlled, just occurring. This is not emptiness. Emptiness suggests absence. This is fullness, without organization. Experience, without a center point. If awareness is still here, it is not watching. If attention is still present, it is not focused. There is no stance, no position to maintain. Even the idea of resting is no longer relevant. Rest has already begun on its own. The body is doing what it does best when left alone. The mind is following, not because it is told to, but because nothing is asking it to do otherwise. You are not falling asleep. Sleep is happening where you are no longer needed. There will be no moment you can point to and say, "This is when it happened," because pointing requires a self, and the self has already loosened past that function. Soon, even these words will feel unnecessary, not wrong, just irrelevant. Language dissolves the same way identity did. Gradually, without drama, one phrase arrives, then nothing, then another, then space again. This space is not waiting for anything. It is not a gap to be filled. It is simply the absence of demand. If sleep comes, it will not announce itself. If it does not, nothing is lost. The night does not measure success by outcome. It measures balance by release. Release has already occurred. What remains does not need to be named. It does not need to be kept. It does not need to be remembered. The system is complete for now, and whatever comes next will come without instruction, without effort, without you needing to be there to make it happen.